Hello, welcome to this week's CleaveTech Tech Tip. Now, you may have seen my video that I unboxed my new project. Well, it's not really my project, it's a project that I'm fixing up for somebody else to go racing. But you can see the parts in front of me here, and it's a Slot Stox car. If you don't know what a Slot Stox car is, then I'll be showing you a little bit more information about that after the intro. But this is the stuff that I've been given to fix this car up. This is my job, to try and make this car a runner again. And I've got a guide with a guide tab. It's broken off the car. I have one braid, some back axle, a couple of gears, some tyres and bits and pieces. So I'm going to have to add some more to this car to make it work. But the first task is to strip it all down so it's ready for a rebuild. So what is a Slot Stox? Well, take a look at this video and these few pictures coming up, and that will give you some idea of what a Slot Stox actually is.
Don't worry, James, we'll soon catch up.
Oh, yeah! That one. White, red, green.
Come on, Gavin, use the bumper.
Use the header, anyway. Well done, Bruce.
So you can see there's quite a lot of crashing goes on in Slot Stox. You can see the tracks have a little chicane where all the lanes come together, so that you can actually push the other cars off of the track, and that is part of the racing. That said, the cars then have to be fairly robust. They're also fairly heavy. In fact, there is a maximum weight limit for a car rather than a minimum weight limit, because obviously the heavier the car, the harder it is perhaps is sometimes to push off of the track. That's why you can see all this lead on this car. And you've also noticed from the images that the cars travel around left-hand corners, so a lot of the weight is biased on the left-hand side of the car. So obviously I'm going to take a picture of what the car looks like now and where the lead is laid out. It might not quite go back in the same position as this, but at least I can return it to this if I needed to after the rebuild. Now, if you've seen my previous video, my unboxing, I'll put a link on the screen up here if you haven't. It's only a little short video, but I pointed out that definitely the motor needs a bit of a rebuild. You can see this bearing, the cam bearing at the back, is very, very worn. So I'm going to have to take the motor out anyway. And once I've taken the motor out, I'm going to take all this lead off the chassis, check the chassis over for chassis joint breakage. You can see perhaps around the back here there might be a broken joint. It's a bit hard to tell until I clean it up thoroughly and have a closer look, but that joint doesn't look too great. There's also some joints around the front end that might be slightly cracked around here. There might be a crack in the joint there. Again, I'll clean it up, have a closer look, and then we'll see what needs repairing there. I also want to do a little bit of chassis work because I want to make sure this chassis handles a little bit better than it did sort of back probably 20 years ago when it was built. It might even be that old, I think. So let's pull this motor out and strip off some of the lead so we can start to have a look at this chassis in a little bit more detail. So you can see the chassis is in quite a state really. Plenty of layers of old glue on the chassis and everything when I've removed the lead. But it's also worth removing this big lead here, because you can see on this drop arm here, this drop arm part, you can see that it's actually slightly split where it meets the tubing or the hinge of the drop arm. So it's a good job I did remove the lead so I could get to this joint and repair that joint as well, because when you look underneath you can't really see any evidence of that split joint, but obviously from on top, yes you can. I might even put a little bit of bracing over the top when I repair the chassis, just to make sure that that joint stays nice and secure and solid. Obviously at some point it's had a big knock and the guide tab's fallen off. I don't remember putting it on like that back in those days. I thought I would have soldered it on a little bit more, to a bit more material than that. I think there was actually something here that was acting as a bit of a stop originally on the chassis, but that seems to be gone now. But I'll start by scraping off some of this old glue before I clean up the chassis in more detail. In regards to the motor, well, we can see that that bearing is definitely shot. You can see it's probably even come out of the can itself. You can see the bearing actually wobbling in the can, so that shouldn't be hard to get that bearing out of there. The M-bell bearing, if I hold it by that, actually has no play in it. The M-bell bearing seems really nice. There's no excessive play in that. But when I strip the motor down and have a look at com size and brushes, you can see obviously one brush has worn more than the other. There's still plenty of life left in them perhaps, but when I strip the motor down we'll have a look at it in a bit more detail, but that's in another video to come. So let's get on with removing some of this old glue and cleaning up the chassis. So I'm just soaking it with some lighter fluid. I'll put a link of where you can get lighter fluid in the description of the video down below. But it's quite good for dissolving old contact adhesive like this. It's been used to hold that lead on. I'm just gently scraping it off with a knife. I don't want to scrape too much because I don't want to leave big marks in the brass, but I can get rid of most of it in this manner here so that I can polish it all up and make it look a lot better.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
So having cleared off all the glue and so on off this chassis, I can see it's had quite a hard life. Nothing really wants to sit that flat. The front wheels are all at an angle, so everything on the chassis really is not great, and it's going to need a fair bit of a rebuild. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove some of the parts of the chassis, desolder some of it, so I can get the chassis properly flat again, and then I can just resolder them back on, and then I know the chassis is at least going to be nice and flat and straight. It's not a very complicated chassis, so that shouldn't take too long to do. So let's start desoldering some parts. Front axle removed. Notice a little technique for doing this a little bit better is to make sure you've got a bit of solder on the soldering iron so that when you put it against the chassis, it conducts the heat into the chassis more quickly than just a very clean soldering iron tip wouldn't do that. So adding a bit of solder to the soldering iron tip like that, then putting it onto your chassis means that the solder or the heat from the soldering iron can transfer into the chassis that little bit quicker, and you can remove the parts. There we go. So I've removed a fair bit of solder. I've removed all these parts from the chassis. So I should now be able to clean this part of the chassis up, make it all nice and flat as much as I can. I can clean up the pan sections here, polish and clean some of those up. You did notice that that little tube fell off whilst I was trying to get a lot of the solder off of here. But I'm going to give it a bit of a scrape off first with a knife, get the worst of it off before I sand it all off in a minute. So let's start and let's try and remove some of this solder. So there we are, you can see it scrapes off quite decently. So I should now be able to just clean that off with some wet and dry in a minute. Let's get the other pieces done. Now, whilst I was in the process of cleaning some of the old solder off of it, I noticed that this joint here is also broken. You can see where the drop arm bit goes in like that. So I think because it's so dirty and mucky in here, the best thing I can do is just to remove these two bits here, and then I'll just maybe solder a new drop arm hinge on when I come to put it all back together. Now, when I strip that drop arm off, you can notice that the chassis has actually, if I hold my hands there, you can notice the chassis has actually had sort of something ground out of it in the past as well, down here, and it makes it really, really thin at this point here. So actually replacing this drop arm holder and hinge would actually be a nice idea, because it will strengthen the chassis at this point as well, because the chassis definitely does not sit flat on a flat block. So anyway, I'm going to be cleaning up the base of this, also cleaning up these parts underneath here, and I'll be back. Okay, so how am I going to clean these pieces up? Well, I've got my piece of wet and dry paper. It's sitting on my kitchen worktop, which is nice and flat and smooth. Little bowl of water here. Don't really need loads of water, but I'm going to wet the part down, and then literally I'm going to rub it up and down on the wet and dry paper until it's nice and cleaned up. And that's part of the reason why I've removed these pieces of brass, because that's the easiest way to clean those up. This part of the chassis here, again, I can clean up the bottom of it quite easily by rubbing it on the wet and dry, and I'll be going back to my bench and show you how you can clean the top of it up. So I'm going to get on with that now, and I'll be back in a moment.
A few moments later.
So I've given some of the brass bits a bit of a clean up, and I've cleaned up the bottom of that chassis there as best as I can. I'll explain that a little bit better when I get back to the bench. But I need to scrub sort of all inside here and so on, and this is where I'm going to be using this stuff, Toro. This comes from the Czech Republic, but there is a UK version called Astonish. I'll put a link in the video description and a little picture on the screen, so you can have a look at that. But I'm going to use this stuff, which when I open it up, you'll see it's like a bit like a paste, like this, and you just dampen your little brush or your toothbrush down. You can dampen it down, rub it in the paste, and then rub it all over the chassis, and that will give it a little good clean and get rid of any sort of dirt and oil and muck and grime that's built up into the chassis. So I'm just going to give that a little bit of a scrub, and I'll be back again in a moment. So I'm back after giving it a bit of a clean. It's not perfect. I've given it a bit of a scrub. As I say, it's more about sort of, you know, how much am I actually going to gain by making it all nice and shiny in this case, and it's not really worth the money for the customer for me to clean it up anymore. They want to race this car, they want it to be functional but still be nice and flat and straight. So I have to clean it up enough to be able to check all the solder joints and reflow stuff that needs reflowing and rejoining stuff and maybe rebuilding the car. But obviously it's not a complete concours restoration of the chassis. So I've done it about as good as I need to in order to progress the build. Now, whilst I was doing that, I've also noticed at the front here, you can see these hinges here at the front. The brass has started to split and possibly wear through on both sides. So it looks like I'm going to have to do something different and look at replacing and changing these hinges as well at the front. So I'm going to desolder those as well before I move on any further. If I did want to clean up some of the little bits a little bit more, like inside here and around there, some hard to reach areas, then I might very well use a little brass wire brush on the end of my Proxon here, which is a really good tool. Again, I'll put all links in the video description down below of where you can get this kind of stuff from, because it's brilliant stuff. So I'm just going to go and clean those little bits up, and I'll show you the end result. So there we are. You can see that when you clean little bits up like this, you can really see all the damage and whatever that's happened to them over the years of slot racing and bash and crash. But that's part of the heritage of the chassis, I suppose, giving it a bit of a clean up. Now you might notice, remember I said I'd explain something a little bit later, you can see here on the bottom of the chassis where I've cleaned it up, and it is sitting nice and flat across here, except obviously, you know, areas like this. But again, I think in the past somebody's added this extra little bit of piano wire that bent round here, maybe for a bit of extra strengthening. The brass has moved, the pillow blocks, the way they've soldered in, has moved maybe a little bit over the years, so I'll have to check axle heights and make sure the axle runs true and straight. Maybe reflow the bearings, check the bearings when I put it all back together. But you can see it's been hacked around a little bit at the back end. But with these cars weighing nearly 7 ounces, and that's quite heavy, so very small differences like this where the weight is not quite as low down as possible won't make that much difference to the chassis at all. And again, the time that I spend on it wouldn't really provide many rewards in terms of performance or handling, so it's not worth doing it all again. I'd end up rebuilding the whole chassis virtually from scratch. So that's not the point of this. The point of this is to bring it back into a raceable chassis in a fairly decent condition and hopefully improve the handling and the grip of the chassis at the same time. Having cleaned all these pieces up, it's worth seeing how well flat they sit on the block. Now if I press on this brass, you can see how these lighting and this reflection changes on the brass. So you can see it's not entirely flat and it's got a little raised bit in the middle. It sits okay at the ends like that on the block, but if I press in the middle you can see how it flexed quite a lot. So there's a little gap in the middle, so I'm going to flatten that out. The other side a little bit in the middle, but this bit's much flatter than the other side. The drop arm totally flat like that. This bit, there's quite a bit of movement. If I hold it there and tap it, there's actually quite a bit of movement and it's not sitting very flat at all. So I do need to bend that corner down a bit. You can see it's flexing there as I press down on it. So I need to bend this down, and it's a little bit up in the middle, probably because of the way it was ground away in the middle here, and it's quite weak. So I'll have to do something when I rebuild the chassis to improve that aspect of it. But I'm going to sort of do a little bit of bending by hand, a little bit of tweaking and bending like this, and get that chassis and these pan sections here to sit nice and flat.
12 seconds later.
So I've flattened the chassis the best I can. This sort of steel centre section here is really flexible and it's really weak where it's been ground away here and here. So I'm definitely going to have to strengthen that up a bit from that, because it is so flexible and weak there. I've flattened the pans out, so they're sitting much better now. So everything's going to sit a lot flatter than it did before and a lot straighter to start with. So I'm going to leave it there for today. We've disassembled it. We've learned some methods to clean up the chassis, to polish it up, a couple of different ways of doing that, scrubbing it, polishing it, etc, etc. We've looked out for some problems, broken joints, etc, and decided what do we take apart, what don't we take apart. And coming up next, we'll be trying to put some of this back together. In my videos about putting it back together, I'll be explaining some of my thoughts about why I'm making certain changes to the chassis, etc, etc. Why I'm strengthening certain bits, how that will affect the handling of the car. So make sure you do stay tuned, and if you haven't done so already, please subscribe. Another thing you must do is hit the like button, the little sort of thumbs up button that's in the bottom corner of the screen down here somewhere on your computer or even your phone, or however you're watching this. But hit that, and then that tells YouTube that you like my videos, and it will then push them out to even more people who might like similar stuff to you. So I'd really appreciate it if you do hit that like button as well. Comment if you want to as well. Let me know what you think about this new series of little Slot Stox videos. Have a watch of my other videos as well. As I say, hit the big C, and I'll be back again very soon with all my thoughts about rebuilding this and how I'm going to improve the handling and performance of the car. Bye for now.